She smiled when she handed me the papers. Amanda's lawyer. Polished, confident. The kind of smile that says we have already won this. And you just don't know it yet. I took the envelope. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at her. I didn't say anything. I didn't react. I just thanked her quietly and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and held the envelope in my hands without opening it. Not because I was in shock, because I had been expecting this for longer than anyone in that room realized. I already had a lawyer. I already had documentation. I already had everything I needed for the moment that envelope arrived. What Amanda and her legal team had prepared for months was a version of me that didn't exist anymore. The unprepared one. The one who wouldn't see it coming. 3 months later, that same lawyer sat across a table from us and couldn't look my wife in the eye. But to understand how I got to that table, you need to know how far back my preparation actually started. Amanda and I had been married for 9 years. Not a short marriage, not a simple one either, but 9 years of something real, or what I had believed was real. For most of those years, we had built a life together in the way couples do, when they are genuinely trying. A home we had chosen carefully, careers that had grown alongside each other, a shared life that had its difficulties, but that I had always believed we were both committed to navigating. I want to be honest about the marriage, because this story is not about painting Amanda as a villain. From the very beginning, it is about what she chose to do when she decided it was over, and the difference between how she handled that decision and how I responded to it. The first signs were not dramatic. They never are. A quality of distance that settled into our interactions, somewhere around the beginning of year 8. Not coldness exactly. Amanda was never cold in an obvious way, more like a gradual withdrawal of investment. The conversations that used to go somewhere started stopping at the surface. The small gestures that accumulate into intimacy became less frequent, and then infrequent, and then rare enough that their absence was visible. I noticed. I am the kind of person who notices things and says nothing until I understand what I'm looking at. That quality had served me well professionally for most of my adult life. It was about to serve me in a way I had never anticipated. I raised the distance with Amanda once, in a conversation that I approached carefully, and that she deflected with the particular skill of someone who has been practicing deflection for longer than the conversation itself suggested. She said she was tired, that work had been demanding, that she just needed some time to find her footing again. I accepted that, not because I fully believed it, but because I had no concrete evidence to place against it, and because the alternative, that something more fundamental had shifted, was not a conclusion I was ready to reach. Without more information, I kept watching. A few months later, I noticed something else. Amanda had always been reasonably open about her finances. Not detailed. She handled more of the day-to-day financial administration than I did, but open in the general sense. Statements visible, accounts accessible. The ordinary financial transparency of a long marriage. That openness began to change. Subtly at first. A statement I would normally have seen, but I didn't see. A conversation about a joint account that redirected before it reached any real detail. A question I asked about an expense that received an answer just complete enough to make asking again feel unnecessary. I noted each instance without reacting to it. Then one evening I sat down and looked carefully at what I could access directly. The joint accounts, the statements I still had visibility on. I was not looking for anything specific. I was just looking. What I found was not alarming in isolation. A pattern of transfers, small enough individually to be unremarkable, consistent enough in their direction to suggest something more deliberate than routine. Money moving, not dramatically, quietly, over a period of several months. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet of our home and thought carefully about what I had just seen. I thought about the distance, the deflection, the financial opacity that had been building. So gradually, I had almost not noticed it was building at all. I thought about what the combination of those things most likely meant. And then I did something. that I have never regretted for a single moment since. I picked up my phone and searched for a family law attorney, not to file anything, not to make any decision I wasn't ready to make, just to have a conversation with someone who understood what I might be looking at and could tell me clearly what my options were. I found one with a strong reputation and made an appointment for the following week. I told nobody, not a friend, not a family member, not a single person in my life. I went alone on a Tuesday morning while Amanda was at work, and I sat across from a lawyer named Robert, and I told him everything I had noticed. He listened carefully. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment and said, "You were right to come in." Those 5 words changed everything that came after. Robert was methodical in the way that good lawyers are methodical. Not slow, precise. He asked questions that built on each other in a way that told me he was constructing a picture rather than just gathering information. The financial movements I had noticed, the timeline of the distance in the marriage, the specific accounts I had access to, and the ones I had been gradually excluded from. He took notes throughout. When he had what he needed, he sat back and gave me an assessment that was direct without being alarmist. He said the pattern I had described, the gradual financial repositioning, combined with the emotional withdrawal, was consistent with someone in the early stages of preparing for a separation. Not proof, but consistent. He said the most important thing I could do right now was not to react visibly, not to confront Amanda, not to move any money myself, or change any account access, or do anything that would signal that I was aware of what might be happening. He said, if she is preparing, she is doing it because she believes she is ahead of you. The moment she knows you are aware, that advantage disappears. Right now, your greatest asset is that she doesn't know what you know. I understood that immediately. It aligned with something I had already felt instinctively. In the days between noticing the transfers and sitting in Robert's office, the impulse to say nothing until I understood the full picture. Robert told me what he needed from me going forward. Documentation of everything I could access, without disturbing anything. Statements, records, any financial correspondence I had legitimate access to. A timeline of the behavioral changes I had noticed, and when they had begun. Any evidence of the transfers I had observed, captured and preserved carefully. He said, don't go looking for things you don't have legitimate access to. What you already have is more useful than you realize. I went home that evening and conducted myself exactly as I had conducted myself every evening for the past several months. Dinner, conversation at the surface level. That had become our normal. The ordinary texture of a marriage that was performing itself rather than actually existing. I was good at that by then, better than Amanda knew. Over the following weeks, I built the documentation Robert had asked for, methodically and without rushing. Every statement I had access to was copied and organized chronologically. The transfer pattern I had noticed was laid out clearly across a timeline that showed both the amounts and the consistency of the direction they were moving. I documented the behavioral timeline as well, not emotionally, just factually, when the distance had begun, when the financial opacity had started. Specific instances I could date accurately, because I had always been the kind of person who remembers when things change. I brought everything to Robert in a second meeting, 3 weeks after the first. He went through it carefully. When he finished, he said, "This is good. This is very good." He explained what he was seeing in the financial pattern. The transfers were not random. They were consistent enough in their timing and their destination to suggest deliberate repositioning rather than routine financial management. In the context of a potential divorce proceeding, that kind of asset movement, made during the period leading up to a filing, was legally significant, not just as evidence of intent, but potentially as a violation of the financial obligations that exist between spouses. Even before any formal proceedings begin, I sat with that for a moment. Amanda had been moving carefully, but not carefully enough, because she had been moving under the assumption that I wasn't watching. Robert said we needed more time, that the documentation we had was strong, but that additional time would allow us to build a picture that was comprehensive rather than partial. He said, let her keep preparing. Every move she makes from this point forward is a move she is making while we are watching. I went back to my life, work, home, the surface-level marriage. That continued its performance, without either of us acknowledging what it actually was. Amanda was attentive in this period, in a way that I found interesting, warmer than she had been in months, more present, more engaged in the small interactions of daily life. I recognized it for what it was, not a genuine return of investment, the specific attentiveness of someone who needs the situation to remain stable while they complete a preparation. They don't want disrupted. She was managing me. I let her manage me. I gave her nothing to be concerned about. I came home on time. I engaged in the conversation she initiated. I was the version of myself that required no additional attention or suspicion. All the while Robert was building the case that Amanda and her lawyer had no idea existed. 3 months passed. On the surface, nothing changed. The marriage continued its performance. Amanda continued her quiet preparation. I continued mine. Robert and I met every 2 weeks. Each meeting followed the same structure. He would review what had developed. I would provide whatever additional documentation had become available, and we would assess where the picture stood. The picture was becoming very clear. Amanda's asset movements had continued throughout the period of our preparation, not accelerating dramatically. She was too careful for that, but consistent, methodical. The same quiet repositioning that had first caught my attention now had a documented trail behind it that stretched back months. Robert explained the legal significance carefully. In a divorce proceeding, the financial behavior of both parties during the period leading up to the filing is subject to scrutiny. Assets are expected to remain stable. Significant movements, particularly those that appear designed to reduce what is visible in joint or accessible accounts, can be treated as dissipation, a deliberate reduction of marital assets to disadvantage the other party in a settlement. What Amanda had been doing fell squarely into that territory. She had been careful, but careful is not the same as invisible, and she had been doing it while a lawyer was watching and documenting every movement. Robert also identified something else. During this period, a property, not our family home, a separate asset that had been quietly transferred into a structure that distanced it from Amanda's direct ownership. On paper, the transfer had been made several months before our first meeting, before I had even found the lawyer. It had been done cleanly enough that a casual review wouldn't have flagged it. But Robert was not conducting a casual review. He found it, documented it, and placed it into the timeline, alongside everything else. Well, he showed me what he had found. I sat with it for a long moment. This had started earlier than I had realized. The preparation I had noticed, the distance that had preceded it. Amanda had been planning this for longer than the financial trail I had initially seen suggested. She had not made a decision and then prepared. She had been preparing, and the decision had already been made. Before I had noticed anything at all, I absorbed that without letting it become something emotional. It was information, useful information, the kind that belonged in the file, rather than in a conversation, or a confrontation, or anything that would have told Amanda how much I actually knew. Robert said we were close to being ready, that the documentation we had built covered the full period of Amanda's preparation in a way that was comprehensive and legally precise. He said, when she files, and she will file, the response we submit is going to be the first moment her legal team understands what they are actually dealing with. I asked him how he expected them to react. He said, they had been preparing for someone who didn't see this coming. Well, they realize he did, and that he has been building this case for as long as they have. The dynamic of the entire proceeding changes. I thought about that on the drive home. Amanda's lawyer. The confidence that I had already observed. In the few interactions I had been part of, when legal matters had come up tangentially. In other contexts, the assured quality of someone who has assessed their opponent and found them unprepared. I thought about what that confidence was going to look like when the response filing landed on her desk. That evening, I came home to find Amanda in a particularly settled mood. Warm, considerate, the performance at its most polished. She had made dinner, opened a bottle of wine we had been given as a gift, and hadn't opened yet. We sat at the table, and she asked about my week, with the attentiveness of someone who is filing away information, rather than simply being present. I answered her questions. I asked about hers. I poured the wine, and I was exactly the person she needed me to be in order to feel confident that everything was proceeding according to her plan. 2 weeks later, the papers arrived. The papers were delivered on a Thursday morning. Amanda's lawyer in person, polished, composed, the kind of professional presentation that is designed to communicate confidence before a single word is spoken. She handed me the envelope with a smile that I recognized immediately, the smile of someone who believes the person in front of them has no idea what is inside it. I took the envelope, looked at it for a moment, thanked her quietly, and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and called Robert. He answered on the second ring. I told him the papers had been served. He said, "Good. Bring them in this afternoon." I drove to his office. We went through the filing together carefully. Amanda's legal team had prepared thoroughly. I want to be fair about that. The filing was well constructed. It made arguments about asset division that were confident in their framing. It presented a picture of the marriage and its finances that was selectively accurate, in the specific way that legal documents can be selectively accurate when one party believes they control the full picture. The filing assumed I had no independent documentation. It assumed the asset movements Amanda had made were either invisible or defensible. It assumed that the property transfer Robert had identified was outside the scope of what I knew about. Every significant assumption in that document was wrong. Robert went through it methodically. For each argument Amanda's filing made, he showed me the documentation we had that addressed it directly. The financial movements. We had a complete chronological record, stretching back to the beginning of the preparation period. The asset division framing. Our documentation showed a materially different picture of what the marital assets actually were and where they had been moved. The property transfer, fully documented, fully dated, placed precisely within the timeline, in a way that made its significance impossible to argue away. Robert said, their filing is built on the assumption that they're the only ones who prepared. Our response is going to demonstrate that assumption was incorrect from the very beginning. He said he needed a week to finalize the response filing, that the document he was preparing was going to be comprehensive, and that comprehensive required precision. I told him to take the time he needed. I went back to my life for that week. Work, the house, the strange, suspended reality of a marriage that had now been formally ended on paper, but that still existed physically in the shared space of a home. Neither of us had yet vacated. Amanda and I existed in that space with a careful, surface-level civility that had a different quality now that the papers had been served. She knew I had received them. I knew she was waiting to understand how I was going to respond. She gave nothing visible away. Neither did I. On the fourth day, she asked me if I had spoken to a lawyer yet. The question was casual, almost offhand, the kind of question that is designed to sound like concern, while actually being an assessment. I told her I had the situation in hand. She nodded, said she hoped we could keep things straightforward, said she didn't want this to become something difficult. I said I didn't want that either. Both of us were telling the truth, in the specific way that people tell the truth, when they mean completely different things by it. She meant, I hope you accept what we have filed, without examining it too carefully. I meant, I don't want difficulty either, but I am completely prepared for it. if that's what this becomes. Robert called on the seventh day. The response filing was ready. He walked me through it on the phone first, before I came in to review the full document. He described it the way a surgeon might describe a procedure they have performed, with complete confidence in the outcome, precise, calm, certain of what it was going to produce. He said, when this lands on their desk, they're going to need time to regroup, because nothing in their preparation accounts for what is in this document. I came into his office the following morning. I read through the full response carefully. Every section was built on documentation that directly contradicted the assumptions Amanda's filing had been built on. The asset movements, laid out with dates, amounts, destinations, the full chronological record of a preparation period that Amanda had conducted believing she was unwatched. The property transfer, documented precisely, its timing placed explicitly within the period of marital financial obligation, its legal significance stated clearly, in language that left no room for alternative interpretation. The full picture of the marital assets, not the selective version Amanda's filing had presented, but the complete version, including everything that had been quietly moved. In the months before the papers arrived on my doorstep, I finished reading. I looked at Robert. He said, "Are you ready to file this?" I said yes. He submitted it that afternoon, and then we waited for Amanda's legal team to open it. The response landed on a Friday afternoon. Robert told me later that the timing had been deliberate. A Friday filing gives the other side the weekend to sit with what they have received before they can do anything formal about it. 2 days of reading a document that dismantles the foundation of everything you prepared, with nobody to call, and nothing to file, and nowhere to direct the reaction, except inward. I went about my weekend normally. Work around the house, a long walk on Saturday morning, the ordinary rhythm of someone who has done what needed to be done and is now simply waiting for the process to move. Amanda was quieter than usual that weekend. I noticed it without commenting on it. She had clearly heard from her lawyer. The quality of her silence was different from the managed composure of the preceding weeks. This was the silence of someone who had received information that required significant recalibration. I gave her the space of it. I said nothing. Monday morning, Robert called. He said Amanda's legal team had requested an urgent call. He said the tone of the request had a quality he recognized, the specific urgency of people who have just understood that the ground they built their strategy on is not as solid as they believed. He took the call without me present. That was the correct process, and I trusted him to handle it. He called me afterward and described it with the calm efficiency of someone delivering a report rather than a story. Amanda's lawyer had been composed on the call, professional, but the questions she had asked told Robert everything he needed to know about the impact the filing had made. She had asked about the sourcing of the financial documentation, about the timeline of our preparation, about the property transfer, and the legal framework we had applied to its documentation. Every question was the question of someone trying to understand how much the other side actually knew. The answer to all of them was the same. Everything. We knew everything. Robert told me that the response filing had done exactly what he had designed it to do. It had not just presented our case. It had demonstrated the full scope of our preparation in a way that made clear that Amanda strategy, the quiet repositioning, the selective asset presentation, the confident filing built on the assumption of an unprepared opponent, have been observed, documented, and answered at every point. The weeks that followed had a different quality from everything that had preceded them. Amanda's legal team filed responses that were noticeably more careful than the confident original filing had been. The arguments that had been stated boldly were now hedged. The asset picture they had presented selectively was now being quietly revised in the direction of accuracy. The property transfer, which had not been addressed at all in the original filing, was now the subject of careful legal language. That was trying to manage. Our documentation had already established clearly. They were retreating, not dramatically, professionally, but retreating. Robert kept me informed at each stage, without allowing me to become emotionally reactive to the developments as they occurred. That was part of what I valued about him. He understood that this process needed to be managed with the same calm that had characterized everything, from the first meeting in his office to the moment the response filing had been submitted. Emotion was not useful here. Precision was useful. Patience was useful. The documentation we had built was the most useful thing of all. A mediation session was scheduled for 3 weeks after the response filing. Both legal teams present, both parties present, the formal structured setting in which the gap between what Amanda had expected and what our preparation had produced was going to become impossible to avoid. I prepared for it the way I prepared for everything. In this process, carefully, without drama, Robert and I met twice in the week before the session. He walked me through what to expect, how to conduct myself, what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. He said, "You don't need to perform anything in that room. The documentation performs for you. Your job is simply to be present and to let the process do what it is designed to do." I said I understood. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You have handled this better than almost anyone I have worked with." I thanked him. I meant it. The morning of the mediation, I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, just because the way you present yourself in important moments is a form of respect for the process and for yourself. I arrived at the building early, sat in the lobby for a few minutes, thought about the Thursday morning when the papers had arrived and Amanda's lawyer had handed them to me with that particular smile. Then I took the elevator to the floor where the session was being held and walked into the room. Amanda's lawyer was already seated. She looked up when I came in, and the smile that had been so visible on the morning she handed me the papers was nowhere on her face. The mediation room was quiet when I sat down. Long table, neutral decor, the kind of room designed to communicate that what happens here is procedural rather than personal. I appreciated that. Amanda arrived a few minutes after me. She sat across the table without making eye contact. Her lawyer sat beside her, composed in the professional way that good lawyers are always composed in formal settings. But there was something different about the quality of her composure today. It was effortful in a way it hadn't been on the morning she had handed me the papers. That morning the composure had been natural, the ease of someone who believes they are in control of what is about to happen. Today it was maintained. There is a difference, and I could see it clearly. The mediator opened the session, and the process began. I want to describe what followed, without overstating it, because the satisfaction of that room was not loud. It was not the dramatic reversal of a courtroom scene in a film, where someone stands up and delivers a speech. That changes everything. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more complete. Robert presented our position methodically. The documentation we had built over the months of quiet preparation was laid out clearly and in sequence. The financial movements Amanda had made during the preparation period, their timeline, their destinations, their legal characterization as dissipation of marital assets, were presented with the precision of someone who has had months to organize them into the clearest possible account. The property transfer was addressed directly, its timing placed explicitly within the period of marital financial obligation, its legal significance stated plainly. The full picture of the marital assets, not the selective version Amanda's original filing had presented, but the complete and documented version, was placed on the table, where everyone in the room could see it. Amanda's lawyer responded. She was professional throughout. I want to be clear about that. She made the arguments available to her with the competence of someone who is good at their job, even when the material they are working with has been significantly weakened. But the arguments were defensive in a way the original filing had not been. She was explaining, rather than asserting, managing the damage, rather than pressing an advantage. The advantage was no longer hers to press. At one point, the mediator asked a direct question about the property transfer and its timing relative to the marriage. Amanda's lawyer answered carefully, precisely, with the specific carefulness of someone navigating around a piece of documentation they cannot argue away. I watched Amanda during that exchange. She was looking at the table, not at her lawyer, not at me, at the table. The expression on her face was not anger. It was something more complicated than that. The specific expression of someone who prepared extensively for an outcome and is sitting in a room where a different outcome is becoming inevitable. The mediation ran for most of the day. There were breaks, private sessions between each party and their lawyer. The careful procedural movement of a process working toward a resolution that both sides could formally accept. By the late afternoon, the shape of the settlement was clear. The asset division reflected the complete picture of the marital finances, not the selective version Amanda's strategy had been built around. The property transfer and the financial movements of the preparation period were factored into the settlement in a way that materially affected the outcome. The result landed significantly in my favor, not because I had been aggressive, not because I had retaliated, or escalated, or done anything other than prepare carefully and let the documentation speak, but because Amanda's strategy had been built on a foundation that turned out not to exist. She had prepared for a version of me that had stopped existing the day I walked into Robert's office, the version that didn't see it coming, the version that would receive the papers unprepared and spend the first weeks of the process simply trying to understand what had happened. That version had been replaced, months before the papers arrived, by someone who had been watching, documenting, and building a case with the same quiet patience that had always been the most reliable thing about me. Amanda had not known that version existed. Her lawyer had not known, and by the time they understood it clearly, it was already too late to account for it. We left the building separately. I walked to my car in the early evening. The sky was the specific color it gets. In the last hour of light, somewhere between gold and gray, I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, not with triumph, not with the charged energy of someone who has just won something they fought hard for, something quieter than that, the specific stillness of a chapter that is closed completely. Everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved. Everything that needed to be documented had been documented. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the correct room, at the correct time, in the correct language. I had conducted myself throughout with the same composure I had brought to it from the moment I first noticed the financial transfers. On an ordinary evening, in a house that was no longer my home, I had not panicked. I had not confronted. I had not reacted emotionally at any stage of a process that had offered many opportunities to do exactly that. I had just prepared, quietly, methodically, completely, and the preparation had been enough, more than enough. The months that followed were the beginning of something, not a dramatic new chapter. Life after something like this doesn't announce itself with drama. It starts with ordinary things, a new place that slowly becomes yours, a routine that belongs entirely to you, the gradual, undramatic process of building a life that reflects who you actually are, rather than the compromises of a situation that had stopped being real long before it formally ended. I heard things occasionally about Amanda, not through any channel I maintained deliberately, just the residual information that moves through shared networks. After a life divides, I received it without seeking it and processed it without dwelling on it. She had moved on in her own direction. That was as it should be. What I know is that the strategy she built, the months of quiet preparation, the asset movements, the confident filing, the lawyer with a smile, had not produced the outcome she had planned for, because the one variable she had not accounted for was the person sitting across that table, the one who had noticed, the one who had said nothing, the one who had simply prepared. There's one thing I want to say clearly. To anyone who recognizes something in this story, if you see the signs, trust what you are seeing, not to become paranoid, not to become aggressive, but to understand that preparation is not a hostile act, it is a responsible one. The time you take to understand your position clearly, to find the right professional guidance, to document what is in front of you, that time is never wasted. It is the thing that makes everything else possible. I walked into that mediation room with nothing to prove to anyone. The documentation had already proved it. Leave a comment below. Tell me if this story resonated with you. I read every one, and if you want to hear another story, the next one is already waiting. I will see you there.